Hello and welcome to All Along the Watchtower, a Watchmen podcast hosted by two Watchmen superfans. We're going through the entire franchise and analyzing all of it. We're really excited. I am your host, Baylor Thornton. I'm joined by my friend today, Jack Weatherford.
Hello.
Okay, so as you can see, I have a Watchmen backdrop. Pretty sweet. So my first question, Jack, is who has a better Watchmen background, me or Ray William Johnson?
I don't know. I've actually never heard of Ray. I've never heard of that person until now.
Never saw that Fallen Titans episode.
Oh, yeah, I know it. Probably.
Yeah. That guy who had the background of just Watchmen pages.
Yeah.
It's so weird. That wasn't even a comic book show.
No, I guess he was just. I don't know. I guess he was just a super fan.
I guess.
I don't know. I guess probably you, because at least when you have it up stuff, it's for reasons, not just just to be cool.
Right. Okay. So, first things first. What is your experience with this book? Why are you interested in this book?
Well, it's an interesting story. I remember as a little kid. Well, first thing, when I was a little kid, that's when the movie came out, and I saw stuff on TV, so I didn't really know that much about it. But then around high school, I think it was you that first introduced me to the book,
right?
And so I was interested in this, and I first read the book in high school, and I remember thinking, "Wow, this is just I've just never really read a book like it before." I mean, there's comic books, and then Watchmen is basically a subversion of all that.
Yes.
So that's what first got me interested in just how much was going on with the characters and stuff. And then I remember afterwards I watched the movie with you, which was the ultimate cut, which was the whole thing, and liking it. Okay. And then after a while, after I saw the movie, I kept saying Watchmen was one of my favorite stories for a while. I say that, but I feel like even though I liked it, there's still some stuff that, again, as a high schooler, you don't really care about, and it just kind of goes over your head.
Right.
And then the TV show came out last year, and I watched that. And probably for the first time, that was when I really started to notice the political undertones of the whole thing.
Right.
And kind of going the idea about how your heroes aren't always your heroes. These, the Minutemen who are glorified and now years later, they're kind of frowned on and rejected. It's kind of it shows how the viewpoint of people can turn. One reason I like is how the viewpoint of people can turn instantly, kind of in The Incredibles, which that movie has a lot as sort of some similarities of this one.
Right. Technically, that was our first exposure. We saw that as little kids, and
we were in kindergarten when that came out.
Story.
Yeah.
My turn. I first wanted to read this book in 4th grade because in 3rd grade I saw The Dark Knight, and the trailer for Watchmen was in front of it, and I thought it looked amazing.
Right.
Of course, I didn't actually read the book or see the movie until 7th grade, and even that's probably too young.
Probably.
So at that point, I was a fan, but I still didn't really understand it.
Yeah, I get it. There's so much to digest in it.
Yeah, I just took it as a straight read and thought it was this cool, dark story about superheroes, which it's not. It's so much more than that. We're getting into really the point of this podcast is to get into all of it and truly understand why it is the greatest comic book of all time and one of Time Magazine's top 100 English novels since 1923.
Right.
Yeah, it's seriously this acclaimed, and for very good reason, I feel. This book was really the first of several instances where that proved that graphic novels can be taken as seriously a medium as literature, just straight up prose.
Totally.
Okay. And so there's several reasons why. One, just the form of this book. We're getting into all the tricks of this book because so much of it is just Moore and Gibbons trying to see how far they can possibly take this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's like no holds barred in this book.
Yeah, just like stylistically, it reminds me of a lot of like Nabokov and James Joyce. Just like a writing exercise. How far can we take this? How many like visual puns can we throw in?
Right.
How long can we stay inside these really strict like panel structures? And how many subplots can we throw in and that still all add up?
Right,
You know?
right.
Yeah, so much going on like that. That's one reason. Two is what it has to say about comic books in general, because this whole thing is a subversion of Silver Age comic books.
Right.
Silver Age comic books and all of their agency-driven, inherently conservative messages.
Right.
Because all of the premise of a superhero is like it's sort of Randian. It's like have like this guy who it's like this argument that there's like inherently better beings that should have all of the power instead
Right.
of the average citizen.
Yeah,
And so
that's what like started like Superman and stuff.
yeah, so this book like strips all of that out and like points that out for the fallacy that it is, and we're gonna get into all of that.
Yes.
And the third reason is what it has to say about 80s America. Because if V for Vendetta was Alan Moore's statement on Margaret Thatcher's England, this is very much his statement on Ronald Reagan's America.
Right, right.
Really every like fear of the bomb that went on in those days, because
totally.
people felt that way about like we do now about like climate change and public shootings. Like people just went on with their lives thinking at any moment they could be toast. Like it was a really scary time.
I just watched a video about that. How any moment, like Russia or America could get mad at something and all hell breaks loose.
Was it the Todd in the Shadows?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'll stop the world.
Yeah, exactly. That was on my mind because that video came out, 2 days ago?
That's the general thing. And our advice for you is to please buy the book and read along with us. Don't watch the movie yet. Don't even watch the show yet, as good as that is. Don't watch the motion comic on YouTube. It's okay, but it does not add up to physically reading the book.
Right.
So you can find it at any bookstore or on Comixology or whatever else you use. Just please read along with us. You'll enjoy it for sure. Okay. So, anything else you want to say before we get started?
No, I'm ready. I'm ready if you are.
Okay. First trick of this book is literally the goddamn cover. Because this is true for all of the chapters. The cover page of the chapter is the first panel of the issue. That is crazy to me. Because look, this is the standard cover. The zoom in on the smiley badge. You open it up.
And the first thing you do is like a closer, like a panned out version of it.
Yeah, it zooms out to this, and then it zooms out even further to the street. All of the chapters do this, and I think it's great.
Yeah, I do too. I'm definitely going to talk a lot about the visual cues and stuff in it because there's just so many good ones. And I feel like I won't be able to get through all of them in this podcast.
Oh no, we're not going to talk about all of them, just all different like types.
Right.
Yeah, because that would take literal hours to go through all of them.
Oh, totally. Okay,
so the first thing that happens is Rorschach's Journal, October 12th, 1985. Dog carcass and alley this morning. Tired tread on burst stomach. This city is afraid of me. I have seen its true face. What do we think of this opening monologue?
Knowing what happens to like Rorschach now, you can definitely see why people are afraid of him.
Yes, because this is a very dark, very violent monologue going on.
Totally.
It's equal parts badass and also kind of insulting. Also kind of obnoxious.
Yeah. I will get into this later, but when we read more of Rorschach's journal entries. Some of them will just come across now as kind of pretentious.
Yeah. The accumulated filth of all of their sex and murder will foam up about their waists, and all of the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
What I noticed about that panel is it's that thing while a man is holding up a sign saying the end is nigh.
He comes back. That homeless looking guy, he's important.
Yeah, he is very important. And also the first one it says the street are extended gutters and the gutters are full of blood, and when the drains finally scab over, all of the vermin will drown. So it's both figured. I noticed how like they use that both figuratively with the writing and literally with the drawing.
Yes, the blood is literally going inside the drain. That's
Yes.
just the first of many, many visual jokes, and they only get better as it goes along.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Rorschach, he's kind of cool, kind of annoying, but he's also a political whack job because
Yes.
the movie does not really go into this, but in the comic, he goes as far to say, footsteps of good men like my father or President Truman, decent men who believe in a day's work for a day's pay.
A
He
day's work for
admires
a day's pay, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very conservative thing to say. And he admires President Truman. And later on, we see notes of him when he was younger, and he says he explicitly admires him because he dropped the bomb on Japan.
Yeah.
At the end, something called 11-2 happens, and we won't say what it is yet, but
No.
something very similar happens, and his reaction is very different. So this is one of two hypocrisies that I noticed in this first issue alone.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. So then after this monologue, we get to the cops investigating Eddie Blake's home because we see this guy just been thrown out the fucking window.
Yes. Yes.
And these cops are always on the vigilante trail. They also come back.
Right.
And there's similar like things going on here. Similar like transitions. Like we see the mirror and then Eddie's face like smashed against the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And the ground floor coming up as he's heading down to the ground.
Yeah.
And all this is intentional. It's all very much like visual sort of humor.
Right. I find it interesting while all the images showing like Blake's death are all in this like this red kind of aurora.
Yes.
And I also noticed how in the one comic the cops are talking and says, this Blake guy, this occupant had muscles like a weightlifter. He would have put up some kind of fight, I'm certain, while it just shows him getting beaten the living hell out of.
Yeah, so it's very one-sided, easy death. And we see that this is 1985, yet the vice president is Gerald Ford, meaning all of this time Nixon has been in office.
And I guess they never passed the rule because after FDR was elected, they like passed something which says you can't serve more than 4 terms.
Yeah, I think in this universe, Nixon repealed that amendment.
Right.
Yeah, so what I find interesting that it's specifically Ford in this photograph, not Spiro Agnew. So despite that, the alternate history, something still must have happened where Spiro was forced out.
I agree, yeah.
We get our first good view of the world, the New York City of this book. We see these cars that look very different, like these like bulbous cars.
Right.
That we later find out that's because they're electric, created by Dr. Manhattan.
Yes.
And the KT-28 drugs that the Knot Tops use, that's mentioned. The pirate comics is mentioned in here, the Gunga Diner, all of this stuff that keeps on coming back. Yeah, Vietnam, 51st State, all of this stuff, all this really rich world building going on in just the 4th page of the book.
Right. Where it says meltdowns on the building.
Yes, this meltdowns candy ad that this just shows the sign of the times. Like Ozymandias has like this whole monologue later about how advertising shows the current political state, and this is very much an example of that.
Yeah.
Meltdowns.
I also like to point out how the last panel on page 12 and the first panel on page 13 started the exact same place.
Yeah, the transitions in this book are flawless. They're seamless.
Yes, they're very, very well done.
And I love how this whole page right here, there's no dialogue. It's all just visually showing us this guy going up, hiking up the building.
Yeah.
And we get our first good view of Rorschach himself.
Yeah, going into Blake's apartment.
Yeah, and this is very much a Silver Age design because all of the crime busters are directly modeled off Silver Age Charlton Comics characters that DC acquired. The most obvious one being Rorschach, who looks suspiciously like the Question, all except the face.
Right, with the especially with like the hat and the trench coat.
Yeah, very much like a 40s private dick. That's what Definitely. He looks like.
Yeah.
And so he discovers
the comedian's outfit in Blake's closet.
Yes, he discovers this guy was in fact the comedian, who we'll get into later.
Yes.
So then there's this conversation between the two night owls, two retired old timers, the Golden Age Night Owl and the Silver Age inspired Night Owl 2.
I would like to also point out that when you first see them, the first panel is a close-up of Hollis Mason as the first one, and it talks about how he ran into an old supervillain who he put back in jail all the time. Which in that one I got like a great. This is like one of the earliest examples of just Watchmen's overall like feeling of nostalgia, I guess.
Yes, this book is very much about nostalgia.
Definitely about the past. To
the point where this quote unquote hero and villain can meet up at a supermarket and be friends. Like, that is like a subversion of everything we know about this genre.
Definitely.
So just these guys hanging out, and when Dan Dryberg leaves, first we see this sign that says obsolete old models, we fix them, meaning that showing us that these guys are very much stuck in the past.
Right.
And we see graffiti saying who watches
the Watchmen
and Pale Horse, which who watches the Watchmen, that's obviously like the famous quote that the book is modeled off from. And
exactly.
Pale Horse is this punk rock band that keeps on coming out that keeps on getting mentioned throughout this whole thing. And speaking of nostalgia, here's the first nostalgia billboard, because that's a perfume by Adrian Veidt. So then we get to the first encounter between Dan and Rorschach, which sets up two running gags, I'd like to say. First, the chain is busted. And it's a running joke throughout this whole book that Dan keeps on having to buy new chains because Rorschach keeps on breaking them.
Right.
And when he walks in, he sees Rorschach is helping himself to beans and sugar. And we see, that's another running joke. Dan keeps on running out of food because Rorschach keeps on eating it all. And this is specific. This is the other hypocrisy, the one of two hypocrisies I mentioned earlier, because he lives entirely off this other man's food. Yet later on, he blasts his landlady for quote unquote cheating on welfare. I don't know about you, but stealing someone else's food is so much worse than government assistance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they have this encounter, and
Rorschach tells Dan that the comedian is dead.
Yes.
And this is the first time he finds this out, because this is the first time they find out that he's the comedian, because they don't know.
Yeah, they didn't know his identity. And this is also the first instance of Rorschach's sense of humor, because he has this really like dry, bleak sense of humor, like one-liners he keeps on spilling out, like when because we see the badge with blood on it, and Dan says, "What's that stain? Is it bean juice?" And Rorschach says, "That's right, human bean juice."
Right.
Yeah, he has several good singers later on. So then they go downstairs to Dan's old like lair.
Yeah, his garage.
Yeah, in the garage. And we see Archie, his ship.
Yes. Which he hasn't used in years, obviously.
Yes. Yes, it's very dingy because he's long retired. And this is where we find out that these two were in the 70s were specifically partners.
Yeah. Until Dan left it, because it says here, those are good times, Royce. Yeah, great times. What happened to them? And Royce just bluntly goes, "You quit."
Yeah, which technically at this point, vigilantism is illegal unless if you're government sponsored.
Right.
Yeah, but
kind of like kind of like in The Incredibles for anyone who watches it and hasn't read the book but has seen Incredibles.
Right, except for Rorschach, who's long been a fugitive because of his hero work.
Yeah, and also mention the last panel, going back in our theme of nostalgia. It's Dan sitting down next to his old Night Owl costume. Another in the lawn like images of nostalgia, because it shows him looking kind of. It shows him almost kind of looking reminiscent.
Yes. Now, I'll also say that, and I'm being serious about this. If you look at his cowl, it's very much a phallus. It looks like a giant penis in there, which is important because throughout his whole character arc, there's this constant line between superheroism and his sex drive. Right now, he's not. Right now, he hasn't done it in years, so he's very much like sexually frustrated. That goes back later.
And also, it's kind of going back to Dan. I always feel like he's having a midlife crisis.
Yes, very much so.
Because he's enjoying this, and now he's pretty much just, again, he's now not a very tough guy. He's kind of a wimp.
Yeah, he's very flabby.
Yeah, and then when his costume is on, I feel like that gave him a lot of self-motivation and self-esteem, and now that he doesn't do it anymore, he's kind of lost that edge in him.
Yes. Okay, so moving on, we get this shot of Rorschach on the rooftop. And I would like to say now, like, this book does a very good job displaying really dark moods while still having color, because there's a lot of orange and a lot of purple in this book.
Yeah, it's kind of like when The Killing Joke was first released, until they went in and redid all the colors. That also had a lot of very bright colors in it that mixed with the very dark story.
Yeah, like, and I really dig that because, like, opposed to the movie Watchmen, which is all like very gray, very black,
very like dark bluish.
Yes, as opposed to this book, which manages to express all of those moods with actual like colors. I think that's really cool.
Right.
And then here, this is where he talks about the landlady and how she's cheating on welfare, and he doesn't like how she sleeps around with 5 different guys at least, which he slut shames like that because of his mother, because his mom was a prostitute.
Yeah, and then the next part, kind of going on, I mentioned earlier how it kind of sounds like just pretentious. The next part he says, "Beneath me, this awful city, it screams like an abattoir full of retarded children in New York." At some point, it's just like, oh, screw off. That sounds really, you just sound really like, what are you talking about?
A slaughterhouse of mentally disabled kids. Like, God, that's such a horrible image.
Yeah. Sometimes it sounds like he's trying too hard to be like poetic.
Right.
Than he really is.
It's worth noting that Alan Moore hated this character.
Oh yeah. Again, we'll mention this a couple times before, but Alan Moore explicitly stated that he wanted Rorschach to be essentially what Batman would be if he actually existed in the real world. What he thinks he would actually be like.
Yes. Okay, so then Rorschach goes to the bar, and
Yeah, Happy Harry's.
graffiti on the bar says Viet Bronx, which is important because this is the first instance that shows like the infusion of Vietnamese culture with America. After
Right.
after this version of the Vietnam War, Vietnam became an official state. It reminds you a lot of the first Blade Runner because in that movie, like Asian culture is very much infused with Western culture.
Right, right.
The inspiration for that, I feel.
Yeah. So anyway, he goes to the bar and tries to find out from the patrons there, which is full of just these downright just awful people, like who killed the comedian, because he tells Blake early on that he has a theory that people are like picking off like old superheroes on purpose.
Yeah, he tells Dan this conspiracy theory he has that all of the old vigilantes are in trouble.
Right.
Yeah. And at this point, you really see that people are really afraid of this guy because he grabs somebody's arm and starts breaking off
Breaking up
fingers.
and one by one in the most grotesque way possible.
Yeah, in pursuit of information that he doesn't even get. So this
I
guy,
also like to, yeah. So I just want to also point out in the next panel how futuristic the cigarettes and sunglasses look in this 1985.
well, I didn't even notice the cigarettes. Yeah, I noticed the cigarettes, but not the sunglasses. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
notice that they have that wire down there. It just again kind of shows how everything's just this in 1985 is drastically different due to the different events that happen.
Yeah, and those weird cigarettes, like bulbous ones, like I believe it's like a vape, but I'm not certain.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not even sure what function the sunglasses do now with that wire.
I don't know. But yeah, it's very different fashion from the real ladies. Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Okay, so then this next part is when he visits Adrian Veidt, who you think is a sellout. I don't disagree. Like, because he did turn his superhero persona into like this multimedia franchise.
Yeah, that's what he says. Rorschach is talking to him about the comedian and says he stood up for his country, right? He never let anybody retire him. Never cashed in on his reputation. Never set up a company selling books and selling posters and diet books and toy soldiers based on himself.
Yes.
It also is kind of just symbolism of how, again, how the original comics, like again, Batman started out being for adults, but again, it started gearing towards kids with all the 60s TV shows and action figures. It kind of shows all these superheroes that are more adult can sometimes be targeted for like a younger audience.
Yeah, that is a good point. I didn't think of that. And on the newspaper, we see the doomsday clock is 5 minutes until midnight, which is still sadly a lot better than it is now.
Right.
Do you know where we're at now?
No, and frankly I don't want to know.
100 seconds. That is pathetic. Shame on
you. I try to stay away from stuff like that.
God.
Also going back was also on his desk. You see three of those action figures.
Yep.
Still milking his image.
Yep. This specifically golden action figures. Like he's like painting himself as a golden god. Because as we see later, he very much has hubris.
And he's also he's very interested in just the whole idea of Egyptian gods, which we'll get to later.
His idol is Alexander the Great.
Right.
Okay. Later on, so Rorschach sneaks into the Rockefeller Center, and in this monologue, his response to this meeting is by saying Veidt is possibly a homosexual.
Must investigate this further.
So there's no mistake. This man is a bigot.
Oh, totally.
So then he breaks into this military center so he can talk to the one and only Dr. Manhattan, also known as the Blue Guy by anyone who's seen the characters but not read the book.
Yeah.
Because this blue man who's the only one who actually has powers.
Yes. And I'd also like to point out how I found him like a visually interesting choice, how all of his dialogue is just blue, it's just like in blue speech bubbles while everyone else is just
Yeah,
normal.
that's great. That's a great choice.
Yeah, it really shows just how like different his dialect is. Same thing with Rorschach. Every time he talks, like the lines aren't straight; they're all kind of like scratchy and stuff.
Yeah,
Again,
showing this man is clearly unhinged.
yeah, it real. Oh, I'll get to that when we get to like a later chapter. But it really just does a good job, like giving these characters like voices. While a lot of comic books just the normal text bubble.
Yeah, and the first time we see Dr. Manhattan, he is this giant being, showing us like he is quite literally a god.
Yes, definitely.
Yes. But the other thing we learn about him is that he's potentially a sociopath because he straight up says that a live body and a dead body contain the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no discernible difference. Life and death are unquantifiable abstracts. Why should I be concerned?
Honestly, I'll probably mention this other times before, but when I first read this comic, the character that I most associated Doctor Manhattan with was Spock.
That's not wrong. Yeah.
Because they both kind of the same thing. They both are super intelligent beings that have this very kind of monotone like viewpoint on just like people and how they act. Even though when we get to, even though we'll talk about it later, he was once human, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, he once was a human, but he's very much far off from what it means to be a human at this point.
It's almost like all the power that's given to him has sort of gone to his head.
Like drained him of his humanity to a point where he doesn't really understand it.
Yeah, he's lost his humanity.
So this is also where we meet Lori Uspetsik, who is at this point Dr. Manhattan's girlfriend and is forced to stick around at the military base to keep him company.
Mm-hmm.
And she clearly hates Rorschach, and for good reason, because Rorschach calls the comedian's rape of her mother a quote unquote moral lapse, which is a very disgusting way to brush it off. So Rorschach upsets Lori, and the first real power we see of Dr. Manhattan's, he teleports Rorschach outside of the building.
Yeah, so that's the only. So far, that is the only real superpower we've seen in this comic.
This whole thing, yes.
Yeah, so far.
Yes. So then Lori says how talks about how cooped up she feels inside this base and how upset she is after that encounter. Mm-hmm. So she decides to see Dan Dreiberg, and to see Dan Dreiberg says they haven't seen each other in years.
Yeah, and I like to point out that it definitely plays a part later because Dr. Manhattan, when he asked her this, he's just kind of like, all right, whatever.
Yeah.
Again, kind of shows in the part where he doesn't really, he's lost his emotion. He doesn't really care that much about what's going on around him.
Like, he has emotions, but he's mostly focused on his work. Like, when he's working, he's very much happy, but he has yet to really get anything from human connections.
Right, I agree.
Okay, so here's the last Rorschach monologue of the chapter, and I'd like to point out two things. One, he's looking at this naked woman, but through the window before she goes to bed with some guy, which means I don't think he's asexual. He's clearly like repulsed and terrified of sex, but through little things like this, he clearly has some interest in it. And the other thing I'd like to point out is he goes on this huge monologue about how there's going to be nuclear annihilation. And there's this poster of Nixon saying 4 more years. And it says right here, because there is good and there is evil, and evil must be punished. I shall not compromise in this, which we just saw this whole chapter about what a freak this guy is.
Yeah.
Yet he says there is good, there is evil, and evil must be punished. Why should he get to decide? who is good and evil.
Yeah, and earlier he said we're talking about how he's like decides who lives or dies, but in the very beginning he talks about how everybody will like drown out and shout "Save me," and I'll whisper no. So that kind of contradicts what he says earlier.
Yeah, there's no reason why this guy should have the heroic agency that comic books are all about. So in the last scene is Lori and Dan at dinner, and they're just hanging out, having some fun, and they're reminiscing on the past very much. They're talking about their old costumes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're talking about it like it was a bad thing, but they both clearly miss it.
No, again, I mentioned that before, how Dan is going through a midlife crisis. We went about how he's kind of lost, he kind of wants that edge because without the costume, he's just some guy.
Yeah, I'm sure Lori feels the same way too, deep down.
Right.
And it ends with a similar shot as the first page, because like ends with like another pan going up from the ground going up to the sky, and they're telling the story about this super villain guy with a weird fetish who just wanted to be beaten up just because. Turned him on and getting him killed. I thought that was such a funny story.
Yeah.
And they say there's not a whole lot of laughs these days. What do you expect? The comedian's dead.
Yeah.
And then we get into the quote of this chapter, in which it's at midnight, all of the agents and superhuman crew go out and round up everyone who knows more than they do, by Bob Dylan. That is from his song Desolation Row, which I highly recommend you go back and listen to that song, because it is very much a Watchmen-y song. It's like
it
long 10-minute epic poem about all of these like pop culture figures and like fictional characters, all this sort of thing, like this long list, and just like the most dark, grimy, apocalyptic, like nuclear scenario for all of them. Like that is very much the inspiration for this book in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's the under the hood scene, but which we'll get to later. We'll talk about all of them at the end. So then we get to chapter 2, which I think is even better. Like there's so much more going on here that really makes the case for why this is the great book that it is.
Mm-hmm.
Right from the first page, we get the first of many pages of this sort, where it's this really, well, I forgot to mention, but like every page of this book has this really strict like grid structure to it. And the most recurring one is this 9-page grid with 4 panels going this way and the other 5 going diagonal. And they're all 2 different scenes going on, like contrasting each other.
Yes.
As you can see, the funeral scenes are all very rainy, very dark, while the California rest home scenes are very colorful.
Yes. It does. Yeah, that's what I love. It's just a great job just setting up two very different tones happening at 2 very different times.
Yeah, and this structure goes on again and again throughout this book. They love it.
I also like to mention the first panel, like talks. Sorry, the first Lauren's mother says, "So, what brings you to the city of the dead?" while showing a funeral, which is
there's so much of that going on here. It's
I know
like when it says extinguished and it's the grave, and
the one in the bottom where it shows the casket and it just says it's history.
Right. And there's so much more. Like he said he'd bury us, as he's literally getting buried.
Right.
Wash your hands of this, showing the homeless guy's dirty hands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so much great stuff going on here. And this is also where we first meet Sally Jupiter, who I really like this character. I think she's a lot of fun.
Yeah, she's the original Silk Spectre along with Hollis Mason's Night Owl in the 1940s.
Yeah, and she's very much nostalgic for it, to the point where she writes to her old fans, and she got this 8-page porno comic of her through the mail and thought it was flattering. To the Minutemen scene.
The first, there's like 4 flashbacks to like people remembering the comedian in this chapter, and this is the first of them.
And I'll say the transitions for all of them are fantastic.
Oh, definitely. The one that says
the way
the shining on the picture, it says it keeps getting brighter all the time, while it cuts to like a bulb flashing on a camera.
Yes, all these transitions are seamless, both in and out.
Yes.
And so the Minutemen seeing these golden age superheroes, and as you can see, they have the lamest costumes, especially Mothman and Dollar Bill. They're just comically lame, which I think is great.
And of course, like Hollis Mason's like Night Owl is kind of wearing the same thing. This really cheesy costume, wearing kind of the same leggings that like the original Robin did before they gave him pants.
Right. Except the difference is they're all just hanging out, talking about politics. Because Eddie's anxious to get into the war, and they're saying like perhaps the Poles would agree, while Sally Jupiter is Polish, just doesn't want to say it.
Yeah. Also, I like to point out how this whole thing goes on. This whole thing like brings up the fact about nuclear war, as we mentioned before. I like to mention on the first scene with the Minutemen, you can on number 47, you can see a newspaper say scientists make first artificial wonder element, plutonium.
Right. So as you can see, like we didn't start the fire; it was always burning.
Since the world's been turning, exactly.
Right. So then we get to the worst scene of the whole book. We have to talk about this, but it kind of sucks.
And it's also definitely like hard to talk about too.
Like on one hand, I understand why it's here, as the point is to show like the good old days never were. Right. But I really wish they chose something else, because rape is something you just don't show unless you have a really good reason to, and even then it's really hard to depict it without endorsing it. And it's way too home for so many people, and it's just irresponsible, especially in this case. It did not need to happen. I'm pretty sure most people can agree with that. It's the one point in this book I think they went too far.
Yeah, I agree. Also, I like to point out, during this whole scene, Hooded Justice comes in and starts beating the comedian in a kind of a similar way as the opening. In fact, there's one part right here, right in this part, where it's almost the exact same shot as they showed of him being like held up before being thrown out the window in the first chapter.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's identical. Yeah,
it's very identical.
But then this line always throws me up. Get up, and for God's sake, cover yourself. Why would...
Maybe because, again, I think the reason for that is because, again, 1940s, and like a lot of people consider that kind of stuff taboo compared to now.
Yeah,
so I guess it's just showing the times.
Even now, like, you're not even, if you speak up about it, like it's like a danger to your job.
Yeah. So I guess it's also funny. Yeah, it's also funny how they shows that, and then the next scene she's looking at that comic, which like very like vulgar, just like just kind of, it's a very kind of vulgar comic.
Both sexual exploitation, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But then it also goes into how Sally's in old age is brushing it off.
Yeah.
Like showing that like nostalgia is sort of dangerous, because it shows how you're just brushing off all these horrible things that happened to you.
You just remember the good stuff.
Yeah, and that can be kind of dangerous. Like,
it can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah, because you're remembering what is essentially a lie.
Yes.
Yeah. And she also calls John an H-bomb, which shows that, and she says the only difference that they didn't have to get the H-bomb laid every once in a while, showing how most people view Dr. Manhattan not as a superhero, but as
a god. But as a literal god.
And as a weapon, yes.
Yes.
So in the next flashback we're getting to,
Well, is Adrian's flashback with Captain Metropolis, who how old is he probably in this flashback? Is this probably the 60s or what year is this?
early 70s, I think, late
Early
60s,
70s.
something like that.
So basically it's Captain Metropolis, who we saw earlier, putting together this meeting of this thing called the Crime Busters, which again just sounds very cheesy, old 40s comic, like it's the Crime Busters.
Yeah, that is the lamest superhero name imaginable, and I love it.
Yeah.
They're not
And
called the Watchmen, they're called the fucking Crime Busters.
yeah, and basically he's saying like we need to like do like stuff on this crime, blah blah blah. And then the comedian's basically like, that's a bunch of bullshit. I know why you're doing this. You're just getting old. Like you're getting old and you just want to stay in the past. Again, going back to the nostalgia.
Which he's kind of right, because the things that Captain Metropolis points out as evils are all shit only the most pearl clutching of conservatives care about, because he
Yeah.
points out drugs, promiscuity, black unrest, anti-war demonstration, and campus subversion. Like that is all extremely just extreme fear of liberals and really any sort of progression. Like
Yeah.
these are not things you need to fight against.
I'd
And
also like to point out, I mean, this scene, Rorschach's speech bubbles are normal.
yes, this is before he snapped. And
Yes.
and if you pay attention to the background and where John is looking, he's looking at Lori until Janie Slater pushes him away, which goes back
Mhm.
later. We later see the scene again from his point of view, and it's exactly the same.
Right.
Shows the attention to detail going on here.
Mm-hmm. And on the last scene of this, it's Captain Metropolis trying to get everybody away while shouting like, "Somebody has to do it. You see, somebody has to save the world." While it shows Adrian in deep thought.
Yeah,
When it gets closer, we'll get to that because I feel like that one panel is, especially if you read it again, is very important in terms of foreshadowing.
right. And also just the way this thing turns into such a colossal shit show, because it's showing the fallacy of the idea of a superhero team, because the idea of a superhero is that everybody is better than the rest of them, the rest of the people. It's all about agency. So
Mm-hmm.
when you have all of these quote unquote superior beings together, the only possible outcome is for all the egos to clash and nobody gets anywhere.
Exactly.
Here. So then the next flashback is the end of the Vietnam War, showing Dr. Manhattan and the comedian together on quote unquote VVN night, which is very much a allusion to VJ Day.
Right. And apparently, like, Blake got a Vietnamese girl pregnant, and he's not taking responsibility. So in retaliation, the Vietnamese woman slashes his face, and he just straight up just shoots her.
Yeah, no remorse. Yeah. Like this man could have been a father if he wanted to, but nope. That just went into senseless violence. And
Yeah.
he's a racist too, because he straight up says like the stinking shithole country or something like that. And
Yeah.
like
The point of like the first flashback and this flashback is to really show how, again, even though he may have been seen as like an old hero, doesn't mean he's a good guy.
and
He's a bastard.
yeah, he's a blatant misogynist and misanthrope.
Right, exactly.
And just the fact that they're juxtaposing this with the military shows how little faith Alan Moore has with these institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Because he is a war hero and who's doing all this stuff.
Yeah. And we were talking about in the first chapter how like Dr. Manhattan is like his all of his like powers and stuff kind of has kind of like changed his viewpoint, and that goes right into this where like after he shoots the woman, the comedian goes in this launch trade. He's like, "Yeah, I did it, and you know what? You didn't do anything. What you could have stopped me. Why didn't you stop me? You could have, but you didn't."
Yeah, which if you look at Doc's face, he's clearly shocked. He didn't want this to happen. Like he clearly
Right.
has feelings about it, but because he's so distant from humanity at this point, I guess he has he just didn't want to act on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I feel like this is his whole character arc. Like he learns throughout this book how to get his humanity back.
Yeah, he does. He does. So that's the next flashback, and then we go into after each of these flashbacks, it shows more of the funeral that's going on. I don't know if we mentioned that already.
Yeah, and
But anyway, the next flashback is Dan's, and it's during a police strike. And in my notes, I just put timely.
also, I'd like to say that like this is the first chapter to have like all these like several panels, several like individual panels, but they are still like clearly the same shot. Like that.
Yeah, there's one of those earlier before.
Yeah. And okay, so then the police strike flashback, which again, it's juxtaposing this really awful guy with law enforcement, which shows how little faith Alan Moore has in the police. And which, yeah, timely.
Yeah, I just put timely for that one scene.
Yeah, and so just these citizens are protesting against the vigilantes, saying they want regular cops, which is understandable considering how these guys are kind of assholes.
Yeah, and I also feel like again, it really just shows how the comedian just has this very cynical look on people, on like civilization, because like he likes doing his job, but it's for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, it's because he's a misanthrope.
Yeah. Again, he's on the thing. He just starts jumping down and starts shooting rubber bullets at the protesters. Like he doesn't care about anybody.
Just to be clear, rubber bullets can kill you.
Yes,
very much so. Okay, and there's also Dan in this scene who it's clear that Dan thinks he's doing the right thing, but seeing the comedian doing all this stuff, it's clearly giving him second thoughts. I'm naive. Like he doesn't really know what the whole thing is about. Like he just thinks he's doing the right thing. But
I agree.
Which the blatant misanthropy of his peers is really kind of getting to him in this scene.
Yeah. And that leads into one of probably my favorite parts in this. One of the most poignant things in the story, which still kind of resonates today, where Dan asks Blake, the comedian's like, what happened to like the American dream? And Blake just like, what happened to it? You're looking at it. It came true.
Yeah.
Which, again, now politically nowadays, that has a whole different meaning to it.
Yeah, that's a great line.
Yeah, it's one of those things where that just makes the book like more like it's one of those things where like the book is like seems more timely now than ever. And that's what I really got from that one line.
Yeah, that's why they made the HBO series, because it just shows how easy it is to recontextualize it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so then we cut back to the funeral. Fight, Dryberg and Dr. Manhattan are all shaking hands and leaving. And yet we see the homeless guy again. He was here at the funeral for some reason. And he's following this other figure throughout the street.
Mm-hmm.
And it cuts to this guy entering his house, which is very dingy and full of old frozen pizza boxes.
Yes.
Yeah, and then
and Rorschach's just been hiding in his fridge the entire time.
Rorschach just jumps out of the refrigerator and interrogates this guy,
which we find out is another supervillain from the 1940s.
Yeah, Moloch, which kind of goes into the whole Screaming Skull thing, where he's painted as this villain, yet he's really just a normal guy.
Yeah, exactly.
He's just a sad, pathetic little old man who's dying of cancer and just rotting away in his apartment. Like, there's no reason to attack this guy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Then so it goes to his flashback, which
because
I want
because
I want to say is brilliantly structured, because the whole thing is from the point of view of Moloch in his bed, which
yeah
really makes this whole thing feel really intimate, really makes him feel vulnerable, because if this drunk guy just crashes into your bedroom, what are you gonna do?
yeah. I'd also like to point out how each panel is like changed colors to indicate like the neon sign in the on the on the building.
Yeah, it keeps on flickering along with the sign. That's another thing that keeps on coming back, and I love it. Again, it's the same
Yeah.
structure of the
So anyway,
four.
yeah. So Rorschach goes to Moloch's house to figure out how he knew that Blake was the comedian, and he tells him this flashback of how Blake came in. He apparently saw something that, despite all the stuff he did, was really traumatic for him, and he just talks about like how awful this thing he like witnessed was, and
Yeah,
he says like this happened a week before he died.
yeah. This is where he just erupts. He just bursts into tears for all the horrible things he's done.
Yeah, he
And
just straight up has like a mental and emotional breakdown.
yeah, and despite all of that, he knows something terrible is about to happen that just completely breaks him, because he mentions
Yes.
a list of people with cancer and an island of artists and writers planning something. And
Yeah.
so this is our first indication that there's a much larger conspiracy going on.
Right. I mean, like he talks about like I've done all these bad things, but I've never done anything like this. This is too much.
Right, just completely destroys him.
I also like to point out how brilliant the last panel of the flashback and also the great transition back into the present
Yeah,
of another
yeah,
point of view shot.
yeah, yeah. Another brilliant transition.
Mm-hmm.
So then Rorschach leaves after he finds this phony medication made of apricot pits that Moloch is taking because he has cancer. And what are you going to do? You're going to try anything.
Exactly.
Yeah, very sad.
And so it ends with this journal entry while Rorschach goes to at the grave of Blake while it shows us both like scenes of the flashbacks that we just read while also the comedian like the scenes of him getting thrown out the window again.
Again, off the red tint
Right.
as it zoomed into roses. And even before that, I want to mention the scene where Rorschach is running down 42nd Street, the red light district,
Mm-hmm.
talking to all these prostitutes, saying he was offered Swedish love and French love, but not American love. American love, like Coke and green glass bottles, they don't make it anymore. What the hell does that mean?
I don't know. I don't know.
He's clearly talking about all these different like sexual positions, but he doesn't want to say what he's into, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Showing that I think he's not asexual. He's just terrified and really just angered by it.
Right.
So then he goes into this whole monologue where
How
he,
Blake saw about how Blake saw America and chose to be a parody of it.
yes, in a way that's oddly like it's clear that Rorschach like admires this guy despite
Right.
all the things he did.
Mm-hmm.
Because Rorschach is a bit of a bootlicker when it comes to these really authoritative positions. Kennedy talks about only our enemies leave roses.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty powerful image showing that this guy really
Yeah.
has no friends.
Mm-hmm.
And the best part of this whole monologue is when he tells the Pagliacci joke. I mean, that's an old joke, but it's really heartbreaking in this context.
Especially with the images they show on like different parts of the joke.
Yeah.
That like man bursts into tears is a scene where like he's breaking down,
Right.
and I guess I took it as like a play on words because again, he's talking about how Blake like saw like society and like how he feels out, and kind of the same thing where he feels off, and just like he goes to say Pagliacci is like I'm supposed to be. It's like I'm supposed to be like the guy, like the parody of the joke, why am I feeling like this now? Especially in that scene with the Moloch flashback.
Right. Okay.
I also find like really good how it says curtains. It just shows just a red panel. That's it, just curtains. They indicate like I always took it as curtains kind of like the moment like Blake just smacked into the sidewalk and this whole thing started.
Yeah, and it zooms out to roses, which is another brilliant transition.
Mm-hmm.
And just these great shots of Rorschach picking one up and walking away.
Right.
Along with the Elvis Costello quote from his song "The Comedians." I recommend you look it up. And I'm looking though the dawn is breaking, even though my heart is aching. I should be drinking a toast to absent friends instead of these comedians. I can't do a good Costello, but that's my best I can do. Whatever.
Yeah, what can you do?
It's an appropriate quote, I feel.
I agree. Most of these chapters, the quote at the end is pretty appropriate to what we just read.
Anything else you want to say about chapter 2?
Well, there's one thing. I like how, again, there are some flashbacks of a bit, but they don't show enough to like it totally like. I like how they show enough that you learn like the kind of person he was, but he's still kind of ambiguous.
Right. They don't tell you everything. This key passages that are necessary.
Exactly. And necessary to like what goes on further on in the story.
Right. Chapter 3 is important because this is the first of the Black Freighter chapters, the newsstand chapters.
Right.
And this adds a whole other layer onto the book.
Yeah, it's basically a whole other story going on top of this story.
2, in fact, because we don't see that much of the pirate comic. It is instead just like dialogue bubbles on top of what's going on at the newsstand, and it always connects somehow. Always. Yes. It's always mirrors either the main story or the newsstand story. And it's specifically a pirate comic because in this universe, because of the existence of superheroes, nobody finds them, fantastical or anything like that anymore. It's just mundane. Right. So instead, for entertainment, all of the comic books are all these grisly, like EC horror stories about pirates.
Mm-hmm. First thing I want to mention is the first panel of this chapter, and we see the first lines from the pirate comic. It says, "Delirious, I saw that hell-bound ship's black sails against the yellow Indy skies, and knew again the stench of powder and men's brains in war." While we see like a close-up of a fallout shelter sign.
Yeah, black and yellow.
Yeah, and also war.
While Bernie says, "We ought to nuke Russia, let God sort it out."
Exactly.
Because this Bernie guy he's a bit of an old timer, but he's clearly like an intellectual. He's always thinking about what's going on. And because he's a news vendor, he reads the front page of everything, and it's always absorbing bad news. So he has a bit of a wary mind about things.
Right. I also like to point out, because this is our first time we see the newspaper stand and the kid reading the comic. We mentioned before how a lot like cigarettes look like futuristic, but if you look at the kid, the cigarette he's holding is a normal one.
Either that or it's a joint. It might be a joint.
Yeah, it very well could be. I just wanted to point that out, how it's normal.
Right. And on the newsstand, we see signs saying missing writer, and it's a photo of Max Shea, who is famous in this universe for writing Fog Dancing and is on the island that comedian talked about.
Right.
And another one is a Nova Express issue saying how sick is Dick. Yeah. After third heart procedure.
After third personal heart up, I think it says.
Yeah. Something like that. And Not Top. There's a Not Top magazine showing like Asian like symbols, Vietnamese symbols. which shows like the knot top like gang that we see throughout this was directly inspired by Vietnamese culture after its annexation.
Mm-hmm. I also like to point out how it shows Bernie saying that they gotta just nuke him, while the title of this chapter is "The Judge of All the Earth."
Yes. We don't actually see that much for the pirate comic, but I like to mention Gibbons does a great job making it seem like an in-person, like in-universe comic book because it has all the same like dots of an old comic.
Yeah, it's a good way of differentiating the comic from like the drawings of the quote-unquote real world.
Yes, but we don't see that much of it. We only see like a few pages because the real strength of the pirate story is how well it connects to everything else.
Right.
And in this news vendor segment, we see the homeless guy again holding up his end is nigh sign.
Yeah.
And his behaviors and we see him talk, and just his behaviors and the way he creeps up on Bernie is rather suspicious, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have to admit, as a kid, the Black Vader stuff was always the point that I wanted to like get past the most. Cause I'm like, this doesn't really. As a high schooler, I thought like, I don't really care. It's just some dumb comic story. I just want to get back to the main story. So when I first read this book, the pirate comic was the least interesting part to me.
Yeah, it technically is filler because Alan Moore initially pitched it as a 6-part series, but DC wanted 12.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a way of padding it out, but when you look at it from a more literary perspective and how well all these things connect, you do see how it like adds more layers upon this book.
It starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, and especially the ending, because these news vendor scenes are really establishing Watchmen's NYC as a character. And really makes the ending, when we get to it, really makes 11-2 hit a lot harder.
Right.
I'd also like to mention that Bernie 2, the kid, is sitting on not a fire extinguisher, but an electric charger.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah, because all these cars are electric.
Right. I didn't even notice that detail until you brought it up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so dense going on. Like George Lucas with the prequels. It's so dense, so much happening in every frame.
Yeah.
Okay, so we get this great transition of the pirate guy caressing the wooden bust, and it goes directly to
Dr. Manhattan caressing Laurie.
Yeah, with the line, "I could not love her as she loved me."
Which again, both ties into like, while it's also in comic, it also like goes into like more of this scene later, just more about Dr. Manhattan, as we mentioned before.
Yeah, because Dr. Manhattan clearly likes this person, but he has a really hard time. No, he clearly loves her, but he has a hard time connecting to her because when they're having sex, he does this weird power thing where
he like clones himself.
Yeah, he clones himself and has 2 of them fucking her at once, and then simultaneously he's in the other room working on his experiment. To him seems perfectly fine, but to everyone else seems just kind of weird. To anyone else would just seem bizarre.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to Lloyd in this space, it just comes across selfish, like he cares more about work than like her.
And this is the scene that causes Laurie to step up and leave John.
Yes.
Very much so. And so we get this scene afterwards where it's these panels like this, where there's no dialogue on Laurie's end, and it's all the dialogue comes from Janie Slater talking to Manhattan's ex, talking to Nova Express, and everything that Janie is saying is also true for Laurie as she breaks into tears and walks out.
Yeah. While it shows Laurie walking out the door, it just shows Janie's dialogue. One day he'll find out. He'll find out what it feels like. which now gives the indication that Dr. Manhattan's really not experienced this before.
No. Now this is the first time he's been dumped.
Yeah.
So yeah, then now he knows what it feels like.
Yeah. And in the next scene, it's also leaving a taxi, and Janie saying, I mean, nobody's going to miss me. And after I'm gone, no one's going to miss me. I know that, especially not him. Again, really hammering the fact that other people have the same opinion, where it's just like, this is just a straight up robot. Kind of like what people think of Spock. This is just a guy that just has zero emotion whatsoever, doesn't care about anything.
Right. And she mentions she keeps on smoking, and she says after they find out what he did to me, Janie has cancer.
Yes.
And
there's about to be a scene before we landed that Moloch also has cancer.
There's about to be a scene where Dr. Manhattan is accused of giving all these people cancer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Again, another one of great visual puns is when she's done, Janie's like, it's such a relief just to talk to somebody, right when it's the panel of Laurie going to Dan's house.
Yeah. Some things can't ever be fixed as the guy's fixing the chain.
Exactly.
Yeah, so much going on. Again, continuing the running jokes of Rorschach breaking the chain and stealing the sugar.
Mm-hmm. Also, the one before said, the reporter's telling Janie, like, if you want, we can stop here, as the taxi stops on, Laurie gets out and stops at Dan's apartment.
Yeah, it's perfect.
It's in the very same vein as the earlier one with first floor coming up.
Yeah. So then we get the first real after the dinner scene, a scene with Dan and Laurie, and this is where their relationship is really starting to bud.
Right. Because she's obviously like upset about the breakup, and Dan's over there comforting her. And again, like you said, this is the first scene where they really start to develop some kind of romantic relationship.
Yeah, very much so. And she has this line where she says, I don't know anybody except goddamn superheroes, which specifically the usage of superhero reminds us that this is a whole comic book like issue that was sold in stores that mostly revolves around relationship issues that never happened.
Right.
And so
no, it doesn't.
Violation of what you expect from a book like this, from this genre.
And the way she says superheroes, it's almost like she's offended by the fact that there's superheroes.
A little bit.
I found it interesting. Like she's like, she may have the fact that unlike that part gets to me. It's like, unlike Dan, who kind of wants to go, it goes like we said, unlike Dan, who kind of wants to go back into life, Laurie's trying to steer out of it. Just wants to be normal.
Yeah, at the moment, at least.
Yeah.
Until the next scene, which we'll get to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then there's another scene with the grid, the structure of 5 and 4,
mm-hmm.
and where it's showing Dan and Laurie talking about the doc and as he's getting dressed, and how weird he is, how he relates more to Gleanos than people.
Yeah. I just like to point out again another visual pun where Laurie says he doesn't care how people dress as he's getting dressed.
Right. And then he shows up out of the blue, literally.
Yeah, at the studio, because he's about to do a TV interview.
Yeah, he teleports directly to the studio.
Right. So while he arrives at the studio, it shows Laurie and Dan walking through, and it shows like a gang member is about to walk up about to mug them.
And this entire scene is done with this exact strict grid order. This one entirely,
mm-hmm.
and show with the left ones being the TV scenario, and the right ones being the attempted mugging.
Right.
And I love the dialogue saying they're not paying me enough to handle monsters from outer space. while the movie poster they walk past is "This Island Earth."
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Try not to get the tight corners.
Right.
Another great.
And I just love how the the dialogue from the TV scene just fits so well with them beating up the muggers.
Yeah, there's no dialogue on the other end.
Yeah. Like the one scene where he's talking to a reporter asked Dr. Manhattan a question, will you be prepared to enter hostilities, while it shows the gang members like approaching them.
Right. Then we get to this scene where he's accused of cancer, which we know can't be true because there's a whole list of these people with cancer. Why would there be a list if Dr. Manhattan accidentally gave it to them?
Yeah, like the comedian mentioned before to Moloch in the flashback in chapter 2.
Yeah, so there's clearly a larger conspiracy going.
Mm-hmm.
And so he teleports them all away.
Yeah, like they start crowding him around with him, and he starts to get overwhelmed, and he like screams and teleports them out of the studio.
Yeah, and after the mugging scene, after the fight scene, which is very brief, it's only like one page where they actually strike.
Mm-hmm.
After the mugging scene, like they're like Laurie and Dan are like moaning at each other and sweating and smoking cigarettes. Very much post-coital.
Yes.
Very much linking the line between hero work and sex.
Yeah. And one part at the end, Laurie tells Dan, like, I'm shaky once the adrenaline wears off. I always feel sort of weird. And when she says sort of empty, it shows like Dr. Manhattan in the middle of the empty studio. And I feel like that's good symbolism to just how kind of alone he really is. Like, we'll get into this more in chapter 4, but just because he's so different and more powerful than anyone else, it like alienates him from the rest of the world.
Yes. Yeah, he's very much an isolated figure, and chapter 4 is all about that.
Yes, we will get to next week.
And the sign for the New Frontiersman, which is Rorschach's favorite newspaper, says, "In your hearts, you know it's right," with graffiti saying "wing."
Yeah,
that's a good detail. So then Dr. Manhattan is accused of all this stuff, and when he gets back to his house, you see that it's quarantined by the government. And also there's this newspaper scene where Bernie refuses to lend his cap when it's raining, which but towards the end, after he reads the news, he gives away the cap and the comic book for free, just because he's so worried about the future. The final scene is Dr. Manhattan just hanging out on Mars. Like, he looks really satisfied, if a bit lonely. So, and then there's a scene with Nixon talking about what to do now, because now that America's greatest super weapon is gone, they're worried at any moment destruction could strike. Because it used to be that Dr. Manhattan was keeping everyone safe, but now that he's gone, what are they going to do?
Exactly.
Yeah, Nixon is saying, well, I've seen worse scenarios, until he takes a closer look, and he's like, oh, I hoped I didn't have to make this decision. In bigger hands than mine now. Showing nobody wants to go through with this. There's this final shot. There's the final page is showing Dr. Manhattan and again cutting to the radioactive sign that it began with it. The photo showing that we're going to learn about this next time, and Dr. Manhattan all alone on Mars in this giant, like, desolate panel with the quote, "Shall not the judge of the earth do right?" Genesis chapter 11 verse 20, chapter 18 verse 25. So the last thing I want to talk about is the Under the Hood segments.
Okay, so Under the Hood is a autobiography written by Hollis Mason. After he retired from being the first Night Owl, he wrote this book talking about his days of being a superhero.
Yes, this is an in-universe text that the first 3 chapters have excerpts of. because
Yes.
almost every chapters 1 to 11 end with like fictional prose from some in-universe text.
Mm-hmm.
And Under the Hood is very important for this book because it shows us a lot more of the Minutemen and just how the good old days really never were.
Like a lot of autobiographies, Hollis Mason writes this, which I've mentioned several times before, with a great sense of longing for the past. It's like, I remember when this and this and this, like he's an old man telling a story to his kids.
Sort of, but it's also kind of dark in some ways. Like, it begins with this really weird story where he meets like this guy who was super into like novelty, like fake boobs, and how
Yeah.
he was sobbing while
Mm-hmm.
wearing fake like costume boobs and listening to Ride of the Valkyries on vinyl. Like, that's a really odd way to begin a memoir.
It is. It's very weird.
But then,
Something I also found interesting, he talks about how, for me, it all started. He talks about reading the first Superman comic, and he says, for me, it all started in 1938, the year when they invented the superhero. I was too old for comic books when the first issue of Action Comics came out, or at least too old to read them in public without souring my promotion chances. But I noticed a lot of the little kids on my beat reading it, and I couldn't resist asking one of them if I can glance through it.
yeah, and I have Action Comics #1, and yeah, the Superman story is only like the first few pages of it.
Yeah, but again,
Most of it is all these other strips.
yeah, I feel like again, it's just this great context to how like how people like view superheroes back then, especially the Minutemen in the 40s, to how they've evolved now. Because from what I got from that, it's like Superman's now pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah, he's an obscure character because nobody wants to read about that. They have it in real life.
Exactly. So I think it's
Yeah.
funny how in this universe, Superman is just a character that people have forgotten about. He's not the icon he is now because not only the superheroes now, but just people's ideas of superheroes have just changed because now they're banned.
Yeah. And also, even before the superhero stuff, he's talking about how like all these landlords and rapists in New York City. So it's clearly not all that different from the 80s New York. Like, this is still very much the same place.
Right, right.
Yet these guys were inspired by Superman and especially Hooded Justice, who he
Mm-hmm.
refers to as, quote, this extraordinary being.
Right.
And the events of this excerpt do align with the HBO show's episode 6,
Yes.
that Hooded Justice origin story. So this is all canon. It keeps on. There's all this other stuff too about even though how like they like view themselves like these innocent beings, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least like that's the way they were portrayed. Like they keep on like Hollis straight up says they were these strange guys with really like strong racial biases and bizarre fetishes. Like he straight up says we were perverts, we were Nazis.
Yeah. And he mentions like earlier, it's like before Pearl Harbor, I heard Hooded Justice openly expressing approval for the activities of Hitler's Third Reich, and Captain Metropolis has gone on record as making statements about Black and Hispanic Americans that have been viewed as both racially prejudiced and inflammatory, charges that it is difficult to argue or deny.
Right.
Again, still showing that 1940s viewpoint.
And to bring up the Hooded Justice Hitler stuff, I think that may still be true for the HBO series because remember there's that whole montage where he reads out that like pro-black Nazi propaganda sheet. Remember that?
Yeah.
So that may lead into his sort of bizarre approval for Hitler. Which, remember, this was the early 40s. A lot of people approved of Hitler. It took a while for people to really realize he was bad.
Exactly.
Which is odd to think about in hindsight, but it was true.
When he talks about Dollar Bill, I can't help but think of the scene in Incredibles, the bit where they talk about just how capes are now usually a good idea. I feel like Brad Pitt was thinking of this scene where like the whole reason Dollar Bill dies because his cape got caught in the door and he was just shocked because he couldn't get out.
Right.
I feel like that was in Brad Pitt's head when he was writing that scene.
Yeah, and he mentions and they talk about how how Silhouette was murdered because she's a lesbian.
Right.
Yet in subsequent chapters, we learned that Hooded Justice and Captain Metropolis were gay lovers. They just didn't want to say it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if they mentioned this in it, but do they mention like how Mothman, like what led him to have like the outcome? Did they ever mention like why he just went crazy?
I think he always just was a nervous wreck.
Oh.
I believe he was never not crazy.
Hmm. I always wondered that.
You see him again in Doomsday Clock. That's a good chapter.
Hmm.
And we also see like Silk Spectre becomes like a Ozymandias-esque celebrity because her husband is like this big wig like producer that turns into like this huge star.
Right.
So there's precedent for this sort of thing.
Exactly.
And in chapter 3, he goes into how superheroes weren't really a thing in the 50s, but in the 60s they came back full force.
Yeah. He talks about the 60s, along with the miniskirt and the Beatles, brought one thing into the world that was significant above all others. Its name was Dr. Manhattan. It was the dawn of the superhero.
Yeah, he's sort of the new Hooded Justice. He's the one who inspires his entire next wave.
Exactly.
And like timeline wise, because he's right, like comparing it to the real life history of superheroes, the golden age was the 40s. The 50s were kind of absent, and then they came back full force in the 60s.
Yeah, especially
with the Silver Age, because it all lines up with what really happened.
Yeah, because in the 60s, that's where we started getting all the, not just like the Batman TV show, which is a craze, but you started getting a lot of the Marvel comics.
Yeah, right. That's all Silver Age, Spider-Man, all that stuff.
Exactly. Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, all those guys.
Mm-hmm. And also in the 50s, all of the superheroes were forced to testify to HUAC to see if they were communists, because of course they had to do that. Everybody and anybody who was anybody had to.
Yeah. The McCarthy trials were something, I'll say that.
Yeah, very bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
And they bring up the possible identity of Hooded Justice Rolf Mueller.
Yeah, who's just a strong man.
Yeah, and like they found his body like quickly after Hooded Justice went missing.
Mm-hmm.
So, depending on what you consider canon, he's possibly Hooded Justice, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Yeah. We'll get into that when we talk about HBO. So, anything else you want to say for this first batch?
These first 3 chapters, again, we've already said it's a good setup to this universe, but the thing I got mostly about is because after watching especially the HBO show, these first 3 chapters just come across vastly different than when I first read it. They have like a whole different meaning, and I got a whole different interpretation from it.
That's going to be true for the entire book, because for a long time, it was really impossible to separate this book from Zack Snyder's interpretation.
Yeah, because the movie for the longest time was the only adaptation ever.
He was the only person outside of Alan Moore to even touch it. So
yeah.
But now that the HBO series exists and the other comic books exist, there's thankfully more of a variety, and it's easier to separate all this stuff from the original.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add?
Not really. I think we've said enough. So next week, I hope you read along with us. I hope you're enjoying this, and we'll talk about chapters 4 through 6.
Yes, we will.
Yep, I look forward to that.
I do too, especially chapter 4. That's a great one. That's one of the best ones in the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that about does it for this week, and see you later.
Bye.
Bye.